We'll make someone else. It's being streamed. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidil Anbiya wal Mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in amma ba'd. Welcome to the program this evening. And the subject of the talk today is the world of podcasting and social media. And with us this evening, we have the cast or the hosts of the popular podcast known as the Mad Mamluks. So today, inshallah, we're going to talk about several things. We're going to talk about, starting with the obvious, what is podcasting, the world of social media, the impact it is having in the world today, and how you and I can benefit from it. So before we get into it, I'd like to introduce our guests that are here with us this evening. And also this is being live streamed as well. So if you have family or friends who couldn't make it today, make sure you share the link with them so they can join us, inshallah. And if we can the audience can come together, it'll be easier and it'll be better for all of us, inshallah. So to my immediate right, we have one of the hosts of the Mad Mamluks, Sheikh Amir Saeed, who is an actual sheikh, believe it or not. And he is also the host of the podcast. He's a graduate from Al-Azhar University. Professionally, he works a professional job as a BA/project manager. He has a full-time job, but he does this after he comes home from work. Next to him, we have another co-host, Brother Murtaza Siddiqui. He also works professionally as a database administrator / many other things that he does. In addition to that, he also co-hosts the Mad Mamluks podcast. And next to him, we have the founder, Sayyid Imran Munir, also known as Sim. He's the founder and the host of the Mad Mamluks podcast, and we're grateful for them to have to be joining with us this evening. It works. Turn it on.
Assalamu alaikum.
So let's get right into it. Now, when we put the flyer out, I had some inquiries or some questions that were asked. What is podcasting? So let's start with that. What do you guys do? Who are you?
Assalamu alaikum. So many of you guys, depending on the age group, have listened to talk radio while driving or whatever. And I would say when I was young, I got influenced by this format by listening to talk radio, like right-wing radio shows and stuff. And I got interested in this laid-back style of talking with each other. And essentially, podcasting is just audio-only programming that is downloadable from the internet. And you just take whichever program you like, you download it, and you're streaming the audio format. So we started off initially as an audio-only platform, as a podcast, and we later on.
How long ago was that? When did you
That was
start
about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and a couple of years into it, 2, 3 years into it, we moved into a YouTube channel where we started putting up videos of us talking and stuff. So, yeah, so to make a long story short, basically that.
Since we were additionally from that, I think podcasts are something unique for people to have, because traditionally what happened is before, people only had to listen to news from talk radio, from mainstream media. The podcasting world, it's allowed people who didn't have major funding and large platforms to be able to project the message. It is one of the earlier sources of alternative news. A lot of times people would be forced to hear one narrative about any number of issues. And sometimes people would be censored or whatever it may be. But podcasts gave a voice to average people that didn't have any financial backing. Initially, in the early days, you could just take a laptop mic and an audio format, and you could just upload it to the internet, and the world would be able to hear it. And in the beginning, it was very, elementary. It was, very almost like a very simple format. And over the years, it's developed into something that's extremely complex, meaning a lot of production value, a lot of effort goes into it, videography that comes along with it at times now. And it really, what changed the game was, there's a very famous podcaster by the name of Joe Rogan. And I think he was one of the first podcasters to officially become like a multimillionaire by podcasting. And people decided, hey, there's an avenue here. People are actually interested in listening to people who are not necessarily mainstream, and they're paying to hear their stuff. And so it kind of blew up the entire world of podcasting.
And you can start a podcast just by us four sitting here, talking into microphones, as long as it's recorded into an audio format.
So this could be a podcast
This
itself?
could be a podcast in itself, yeah.
All right. That's good. But the next question that I have, and I've already been handed the question, which I already had written down, is why are you guys mad?
Yeah, so there's a story behind it. And I think that the idea was, there's many different channels back then that were really popular. One of those was the Young Turks. And the Young Turks is a channel that was about, secular beliefs of atheism, and their news revolved around that. But they were really popular, and I found that inspiration was or at least the name behind their channel was from Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who inspired secularism in Turkey. Now, we all as Muslims, we don't agree with Mustafa Kemal, but I like to listen to opposite or opposing views and draw inspiration from what makes that successful. And I wanted a name that Muslims could find inspiration in. And one of the stories we came to learn of was the story of the Mamluks. The Mamluks came at a time where the Muslim world was in disarray. The Mongol invasions had swept into Baghdad, sacked the capital city. Essentially, the Abbasid Caliphate was over for all intents and purposes. The Mongols were on their way to North Africa. So this is the dire situation that the Muslim world faced with the Mongol invasions, up until they reached the area of Bilad al-Sham, Syria, where the Mamluks of Egypt said, hey, you know what, we have to get the Mamluks had control over that region. And they said, hey, we have to get everyone together. Whichever Muslim wants to save this religion, wants to save the situation of Muslims, we have to get them all together. Because at this point in Islamic history, Muslims were scattered and they were disarrayed. They were fighting. There was infighting. Everyone was vying to be a ruler of something. The Khilafah at that point was very wealthy, and so there were other opposing interests that had crept into the Ummah as a problem. And so, long story short, they came together and they fought in this huge battle called the Battle of Ain Jalut. And this battle is talked about by historians, Muslims and non-Muslim historians to this very day, where it was a monumental effort made by the Muslims to beat the Mongols, and the Mongols had never been defeated in all their history. So it was a remarkable moment in Muslim history, and I drew a parallel from that moment to this moment where we are right now, where we are as Muslims are in complete disarray, and we have to find allies and people who are seeing the vision of where Muslims need to be at in the future, how can we overcome our divisions and our problems and bring back glory and prestige and protection over the rest of the Muslim world. And so that's how the Mamluk name. And then Mad just was added as something to make it kind of fun and interesting. I just kind of found it funny that we're always scared of being mad. Like, we don't want the Western world to know that Muslims are mad, because it's like the trope of the mad Arab or something. So I thought it was kind of a fun play to add mad in front of it, just to be bold about it. And we'll say we can be mad if we want to. There's a lot of stuff Muslims can be mad about right now. So that's just kind of the story behind the name. And a lot of people often ask that, and I'm sure you guys were wondering also.
Guess one of the things that differentiates between you, I mean, I'm sure, and I know there are many other podcasts out there, right? But I think one of the things that distinguishes yours from others is you have actually a legitimate scholar that acts as a co-host as well. So I'd like to hear from you what your role in all of this is. Do you provide religious guidance to them, or do you shed religious aspect on whatever subject you guys are talking about, or what is your role in all of this?
Yeah, thank you. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam wa rasulillah. So my role generally in the podcast is, look, we grew up together, all of us. We grew up as children. We know each other very well. We joke around with each other on the podcast. And every single individual has a point that they bring to the table, a strong point of themselves that brings them to the table. If I myself am the one who was traditionally educated Islamically, by the way, all of us are in our own capacity trained Islamically. I'm more on a level of like official educational training in Islamic sciences. So it brings an element to the podcast itself where we're able to talk about things Islamically. We're able to realize if there's content we want to talk about, if it's halal or haram to talk about, but it brings a little, a nice Islamic twist to it. We don't refer to ourselves as an Islamic podcast per se. We talk about contemporary issues with the lens of Islam, right? We're not going to have a podcast where it's just a dars from beginning to end. Rather, we talk about contemporary issues and how it should be looked at Islamically. And that kind of arises from the idea, my part of it is the idea of, contemporary Islamic and fiqh issues. I kind of chime in at that level and bring in my own banter, I guess. So that's kind of where I come in.
So can we say the podcast overall would be talking about contemporary issues, whatever they may be, within the bounds of Sharia, with a lens of Islam on there? Would that be an accurate description?
I think there's one key difference. Some people who are familiar with podcasting or even YouTube videos, a lot of the formats are based on a lecture format. There'll be one person who comes in and he asks a question, and then a person who maybe lecture for an hour or two, and they get great information and content. But what we try to do is, see, one of the biggest problems we found is that a lot of young people, when we were growing up, people and notable names and scholars, yes, we put them on pedestals, but we didn't humanize them. It was very hard to have candid conversations. At the end of the day, Sheikh Amr is a human being like everybody else, right? Hamza Yusuf, or it doesn't matter. Imam Suraj, they're all human beings. They struggle with things. They have regular conversations. So what we try to do a little bit differently is we leave it as a candid format. So we will, at times, just like how we have a conversation with any one of our own friends, we'll have a conversation at that level, and we'll try to make them more accessible and more relevant. Because when we were growing up, oftentimes we had scholars that were very knowledgeable, but they couldn't relate to the audience or younger people specifically, right? And so us growing up in that era, being born here and bred here, going and encountering the issues, we understood the need to be able to have conversations. A lot of times it's very easy to just listen to a lecture and then say, okay, these are great points. But how do you see people who look like you, who grew up like you, who have the same questions as you? How do they, how do we process this, right? And so I think one of the key, it might be different than other formats in the way that you're going to hear a lot of conversation. It's not just going to be a lecture format. We're going to try to bring, and another thing that we also try to do is that we try to avoid echo chambers. If there's no secret among Muslims that there are many different groups and ideas, and a lot of people try to push one, they have a bias to their own idea. And one thing that we try to pride ourselves on is that we want to be as inclusive as we can, meaning within the boundaries of the Sharia, but we try to make sure that people who have, their position and their views, that they have a place to say it, and we have discussions about it, rather than just trying to, label somebody something and then discard them. It's more, we believe it's appropriate to actually have a conversation about these things. So we encourage people who have different views, who have a different perspective, and then we talk about it. We don't let it go unchallenged, but we certainly do want to hear, and that helps us create an environment that it's a conversational format, and we're able to also engage those ideas that may not necessarily be, engaged.
So building on that, maybe you can answer this. So what kind of subjects do you guys discuss? Like dating or drugs or
everything.
What do you discuss? And part two of that question is, what kind of guests do you invite? Do you invite only scholars or friends, family, relatives? What do you guys do?
Our general rule of thumb is interesting people who can have a good conversation. Now, sometimes they happen to be popular. They happen to have their own YouTube channels. They happen to be scholars at times. But
Do you have any examples?
There's several examples. There's
We had Sheikh Omar Haqqani.
Sheikh Omar Haqqani, one of our notable scholars.
Let's talk about people that are actually important.
No, we've had pretty much every major scholar from the United States, like Sheikh Yasir Qadi and Sheikh Umar Sulaiman, etc. So there's this every walk of life. It's not that our rule is that you need to be someone with a certain amount of followers or that you need to be a major scholar, but it's what are you bringing to the table? Are you bringing something new, innovative, something, a fresh perspective to look at something? Is there a situation that warrants you being on? Like, for example, right now with what's happening in Palestine, we invited a guest named Sami Hamdi, who is a popular political commentator who has been making the rounds on many YouTube channels. And we're like, you know what, he's a very important figure right now because he's giving Muslims a very clear, concise message, something that is helping all Muslims come together and have something to rally around,
So just additionally too, it's not always just going to be one topic, right? Because obviously our lives are different. There are different things that happen. It can be related to work, marriage life, just growing up, religious issues, political issues. And so we try to cover a lot of those themes, and we bring different people who offer different perspectives in those themes.
Yeah, so I think we heard the word conversation many times. And I think that's a very, very important element of this podcast. Conversation is every single one of us in this room has been in a conversation, those late night conversations, where it's kind of where you go past like 11 o'clock, brothers are sitting together and they start having very meaningful conversations. And they start almost having these revolutionary ideas. And that's kind of what we try to emulate, because that's kind of how this podcast started. The idea was we had these late night conversations. We all lived in close proximity to each other. And we used to have these conversations at night. We used to talk about politics. We used to talk about Islamic issues. We used to talk about social issues. And then we saw a few podcasts, and this was in 2014 or 2015 maybe, right, Sim? It was in like 2014, 2015. And at this time, Mortada, he was traveling, and we had another host. And me and Sim, we were thinking, how awesome would it be if we can record these conversations and the younger generation of Muslims in our age and maybe older than us can benefit from. And that was the kind of the phase where it's still getting past that phase of 9/11 And how are we going to make Muslims, especially the youth, feel comfortable in their skin about being Muslim? How can they be confident about their Islam, right? So then those conversations, when we invited guests, we would try to find interesting people like Sim had mentioned, but also try to pick their brains and see what type of conversation and what questions we could ask them to bring a normal and natural conversation. So kind of his role, like Sim as a host, you would see that he'll start kind of make a very serious person that would be generally a very serious person on the circuit of public speaking. He would kind of crack them and make them kind of like smile and start joking around. So everyone brings a different element to the table of how do we bring this person who can be a celebrity or whatever the case is, a very a prominent figure, and humanize them and make them laugh and joke and bring another side of them. I remember once when we had Sheikh Amin, from Dar al-Qasim, we ended up for a while kind of talking about soccer and football and how he, likes the game of football and stuff. That's kind of a side that you wouldn't really see of a scholar who's kind of at the level that he is. So these conversations are very, very important, because even in the Quran, the conversations that occur between the prophets and the people, and between Musa alayhi salam and Harun, these conversations are very, very important for human beings to witness and to benefit from. So it kind of follows that method of us benefiting, because when we have a guest, I don't know about these guys, but when we have a guest, my main thing is that how can I benefit from this person? And I do benefit greatly. And how can other people witnessing this conversation, how can they benefit from this, right?
All right. So now that we've established what is podcasting and what you guys do, so I would say that within the past 10, 15 years, and in particular probably in the past 10 years, the speed that the technology is growing and the social media platforms that are growing has changed the world. We can argue for the better or for the worse, but I would probably say for the better, in the terms that we are more connected than ever before. Now, that comes with positives and negatives. But as an ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, which today stands at between 1.8 to 1.9 billion Muslims in the world today, we are probably more connected today than we have ever been in the history of mankind. Can we say that? So we can say that. And the reason why we're able to do that is we are able to harness this power of social media that we have at our disposal. Now, you guys, you do your podcast from your studio, which I believe it's at one of the brothers' home. You do it from there, but you have a reach that is global, right? You have thousands of listeners, thousands of views that you get for every single episode that you do. Now, this is a game changer, which the world had not seen before. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because today, polls tell us and statistics tell us that the majority of the news that people are getting from is not from the news channels or the newspapers or the radio stations, but it is from the social media platforms, whether it is Facebook or whether it is Twitter, now known as X, or Instagram, or the talk shows, the podcasts that you guys are doing. So from that perspective, you guys are playing a very important role in the conversation, not only just locally but on a global scale, that you are able to bring a perspective and a conversation that others might not be able to have. I mean, there are subjects and topics that us in the West may be able to talk about that Muslims living in Muslim countries are not able to talk about, but they can definitely benefit from the conversation that you're having. So can you speak briefly about the advantages and the impact that such a platform is having for the Muslims in general and on a global scale?
It's a great comment, and I think you give us a lot of credit, even though we don't maybe deserve it. There are people out there doing much bigger things as far as social media. But I think the point is still valid, that each and every person putting their effort into social media, it provides a point of view that the world probably hasn't seen before, and that the world needs. One of our, me and Sim have been talking about this is beforehand when we got started. The idea was that we wanted to have a voice. We wanted to, every time we open up the media, and we grew up, we were young men when 9/11 happened. And one of the most frustrating things about that era was the disinformation, the lack of attention given to actual Muslims who live in this country, our actual views. Even when they interviewed somebody, it was someone who wasn't really in the masjid, someone who never really interacted with the community, who didn't have normative mainstream Islamic beliefs, whether it be extreme or very liberal, right? It was something that we found we never had any representation. So that was the birth. I mean, the idea also includes that, the idea that we would have our own voice, that we're not by any means perfect, but I think we can comfortably say that we fit in within the normal body of Muslims, right? Sure, we have our faults, but our views and our understanding and our objective seem to be, in alignment with that. And so to his point, to Sheikh Haqqani's point, is that the idea is that the thing that social media offers us is that we're able to present to the world, not just our local masjid or our community or village. We have people that listen from all the way from Malaysia to the UK, Germany, around the world globally. And I can't tell you the number of people that have reached out and really put valuable input. And another thing I wanted to add that you may not have mentioned is that, of course, we can reach people, but it helps, the concept that we have that we are one ummah, and when one part of the body hurts, the other body hurts, the whole body hurts, right? That makes that connection very strong. We have listeners and brothers that are across the globe we've never even met, but they are extremely supportive. They reach out to us. We have a WhatsApp group for our core members or people who are listeners, and the amount of support and it's a good feeling to know that the ideas that we have here in America as Muslims is shared among people in different countries. It's not a unique thing to America, and that's important for unity and brotherhood, right? Because a lot of times they try to divide you and say, oh, if you were back home, you would think like this, or if you were over here, you would think like that. But this idea that we have this global community, and that was achieved by podcasting, by having a platform. And that's something I believe that my concern, my awareness for different parts of the ummah, it greatly intensified by being on the show, because you're forced to be exposed to things like that.
And the advantage is, if you don't mind, Sim, the advantage is that if you have a podcast and you can sustain yourself, thanks to Sim, I'm not just saying this, like me, I just kind of show up. I don't do anything technical. He does all the editing. He does all the technical stuff. So I'm kind of like the laziest one on this team, to be honest with you. These guys, typical. These guys do all the technical work. I just kind of show up. But
the shiuch earned that right, so it's our pleasure.
No, the advantage of you become a media outlet eventually, right? That's kind of how we see ourselves. What the advantage that we have, I would say, even other podcasts, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. We actually have full autonomy. We don't get paid for this. Like, we have full-time day jobs, and we don't have any sponsors either. And in this climate, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of people wouldn't want to sponsor us, and I'll tell you why. We can speak as raw and as clearly as we want. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, qulu qawlan sadida, right? Say very, very clear, without sugarcoating, word that's truth, and say it straightforwardly, right? We can talk about the LGBTQ movement and how oppressive they are. These are our views. It's not his views and the masjid's views. I'm just telling you what we're able to do. We can call them bullies. We can call them oppressive. We can call Israel an apartheid, oppressive terrorist state. I can say that on this platform. Other platforms can't say that because they're sponsored by other people, and those sponsors can regulate what they can say. I, as Amir Saeed, on the podcast can say the biggest terrorist entity that exists in this world is the Israeli entity, and it's not a legitimate state. Palestine is what it is and what it should be called. Israel is not acceptable, and it commits all types of illegal acts, even by international law, and the world supports them and continues supports. I could say that on the podcast because we're not bound by anybody. So we can actually be the voice, and I'm not trying to brag. We can actually be the voice of those people who are bound by their sponsorships and their contracts and being afraid of losing their job or whatever the case is. If they do it full time, we can say whatever we want, actually. We can say whatever we want. And I think that's very, very important, especially at a time like now. And we understand why a majority of Muslims are very worried about their situation and what they can say. Alhamdulillah, I think we're in the situation where we can say whatever we want to say, you know? So I think that we speak for a lot of Muslims who don't have a voice. We can be their voice for that reason, inshallah.
No, I think that's a great point, and that's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation, so we can all understand the power that we have at our disposal if we use it correctly. Social media initially started, and even it may be used even now today for the reason that it was started to, stay in touch with each other, share pictures, and sometimes occasionally spy on each other to see what someone is up to. But that's what it was used for. But now we see the positive sides to that, and it cannot be stressed enough the importance that having this your own platform and your own voice that can be reached on a global scale, so you can have these open conversations that we're having now. And we're gonna get into that here in a minute. But just to give you an idea that the importance of being able to control the narrative, and this is one way the narrative is controlled, through media. If we recall the first Gulf War that happened back in 91, 92, that was the first war that was known. That is when CNN came on scene. And CNN was the one that was controlling the narrative of how the war was going, who the good guys were, who the bad guys were. I could not, and you could not. No one could give anyone their opinion unless they were on a network, on a platform. They had a microphone. They were able to tell you what was happening, what was not happening. If not, whatever the media told you is what you have to believe in, unless and until you had an alternative source. So now, today, all of that is gone, and the media world and the world in the information world is in a panic. They're scrambling right now. And just to give you an idea, unfortunately, the Muslim world is used to the concept of coups. Anytime a coup happens, there are two main things that are taken. The first thing that is taken anytime there's a coup that happens is, what is the first two things that are taken? One, control of the finances of the country. The finance minister is usually sacked and their own person is installed. But the second thing, and the most important thing, is you usually find out about the coup from what? From the national TV, the national TV, because at that time that used to be the only one, and they used to the broadcast used to be interrupted, and usually you had a general there or someone to tell you that you have a new leader now. Yeah. That's usually how it used to happen. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because that shows you the power of media. That no longer is the narrative now. That no longer is the case now because of what we see here today.
No. I mean, I think that's a very important point, because I think, especially if you look at the conflict now, like if we're going to kind of make this relevant to people who are listening, we look at the issue of Palestine today, right? We see, and this is not, for people who have been following this conflict itself, this aggression, this is not a new thing that's happened there. This is, decades upon decades of, it's a cycle that happens.
Are you saying this conflict did not start on October 7th?
That's what they would have you believe, right? And on the media, if you go to CNN or these places, they have you believe that everything was fine and dandy until October 7th. This was the problem that caused everything else. But the reality is that obviously people who are familiar, and Muslims, mashallah, alhamdulillah, were familiar with the issue, is that this is 75 years, decades upon decades of this. But only until now have I seen, in my 43 years of living, that perspectives are slowly being changed, views are being changed. And the only reason for that is because of alternative news and media. People, and I'll say this right now, the state of Israel does not worry about, can we physically defeat their neighbors. There's no secret that the Israeli military is an extremely capable and strong military. They have a lot of financing and even nuclear technology, but their main primary war is propaganda. That is what they fear the most losing. If they lose the PR battle, the optics battle, right? That's what they fear more than losing land. And I'm bringing that example to light because that's the same battle that we're in every day, whether it's Palestine, whether it's stereotypes against Muslims, whether it's just spreading or making dawah. We are always in a battle of our hearts and minds. And the only way to get into the mind is to be able to have a platform. And traditionally speaking, in order for us to get onto CNN or to get onto BBC, you had to be of a certain persuasion. Either you had to know somebody who knew somebody, or you had to tote that line and say what they wanted to. But today we see very famous YouTubers like Brother Muhammad Hijab out of the UK, who ends up going on the Piers Morgan show. In what world do we see a YouTuber who got famous by making dawah in polemics be able to jump on a worldwide show of brothers? And we have like people like, there's a very, very popular podcast called the Patrick Bet-David podcast. It is a podcast, but it's almost like a news source and millions of views. And you have Muslim YouTubers who have a decent Muslim following are able to now go on that platform and defend Islam against people like Robert Spencer, who's the guy behind Jihad Watch, by the way, spreading a lot of this propaganda and engage them in a debate and dismantle them on a very large platform viewed by 6 to 7 million people. That is a powerful thing. And the only reason why they got there is because they started with social media. They started with small channels that had 2,000 followers to 5,000 to 10,000 to 20,000. Eventually, they hit the million mark, and then people start giving them attention. Say, hey, wait a minute, this view is different. And here's the beautiful thing about this: if you can get the attention, if you have the charisma, if you're able to articulate it, people who run main programs, they like you because why? They love conflict. Conflict sells in the media. If you can bring an articulate person who can provide a rational response and a credible argument against somebody else, and to witness that exchange of ideas, people love that. And media networks love that because it creates conflict. They want to see passion, they want to see disagreements. The same reason why they always cover in the media, they cover war, they cover police chases, they cover all these things. They very seldomly highlight positive things. It's always doom and gloom because that's conflict. So effectively, when you create a channel and you create a narrative that is done in the right way, and you're able to articulate yourself and generate a following, you will almost certainly get attention from these networks and eventually be able to have your say in the news and present a Muslim view on issues.
Now, let's talk about, we talked about Palestine. It's been mentioned a few times now. I want to talk about Palestine, of course, because, as we speak now, it is under, heavy seas and heavy bombardment. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieve them and protect them. And it's very difficult for us to have this conversation, but we must have this conversation in the sense that this conflict did not start on October 7th, as we mentioned. That is, anyone who tells you that has been living under a rock or has been in the coma prior to October 7th. It is as if saying, let's think about this for a moment here. I want you guys to think about it. Who remembers the date of August 6th, 1945? Probably not a whole lot of people, but you know what happened on that date. What happened on that date was the first atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, okay? August 6th, 1945. That's the date. No one is going to say that was a terrible thing. They should not have done that. And, 80 to 90,000 people were instantly killed. They don't say that. The reason why they don't say that is because they remember the date prior to that, which was in 1941, December 7th, was when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And this was in retaliation for that. So everyone knows the context. This is why context is important. Because of that, this atomic bomb that was dropped was justified because we were attacked and we have every right to defend ourselves. That's why they did it. Now, think about it for a moment. Let's say that you did not know anything that happened in, let's say, 1941. You only know from 1945 what happened on that day. Of course, you're going to say this was a disaster. This was terrible. It should not have happened. And you're going to do everything that you can. But you knew the history before that. Somehow, this is justified. We're not going to get into whether it was right or not. But the point being is that you know the history. Therefore, you understand the context. Come back here similarly. This did not start 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. This has been ongoing for 75 years. And there's only really, it's not as complicated and it's not as difficult as people tend to make it out to be. It's not. It's very simple. There's an occupying force and there's people who are occupied. There's nothing in between. I own my house. These three guys, they come to my house and they kick me out of my house. And they say that this is their house. Now, I've been kicked out of my house. What am I going to do? I'm going to try to get my house back. And I'm going to tell you, no, this is my house. You can't have your house. But somehow now, because I have no voice, I have no support, I am portrayed as the aggressor because I want to get my house. But it's not your house, it's my house. But let's say after several years of, arguing and all of these things, I say, I'm tired of fighting with you. Let's, agree to a deal, a peace deal. Let's call it a peace deal. I will give you part of my house, and I'll let you stay in part of my house, and I'll stay in the other part. But you tell me that, no, you can't even have that much. Give me all of it. Give me all of it. That's exactly the situation here.
Actually, it's not even like that. Actually, what they're saying is that
that's the sanitized version of it.
Yeah, I mean, they're giving the perception that they want to negotiate, but during the process of negotiating, he's still taking more room than your house. So how do you
Let's negotiate in the other room. That room is empty.
How do you negotiate with someone who's actually actively still taking land from you, or in this case, your house, right? And so the reason why we have to break these things down like this is because this is where the narrative in the media comes in. If the media is dominated with this, if you go look up the issue today, if you look at you talk to the average American, they're probably going to tell you Jews have always been there. There is no Strait of Palestine, never existed. Arabs are invaders. They never lived there. It's almost as if they were forced out to Europe, and that's why they're just returning back from Europe from 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Like the idea is that, and in fact, and this is where me personally, it's deep to me because this stereotype against the Arabs in that region, just not to go off the rails too much, but the average American doesn't realize that the people that inhabited the Levant, that region, are originally from the Arabian Peninsula. The Canaanim, these people are actually originally from southern Yemen or northern Yemen in South Arabia, where when the dam broke, they actually migrated upwards. And we can look at the patterns from starting in Petra, going all the way up to Palmyra and Syria and areas like this, and in the Sham in general. And then even the Phoenicians are just a name given to these people that made a northward migration and moved from being a nomadic life to being a sedentary life. These people are no different than the Arabs that are in the region today. Sure, they might have evolved differently, have different names, adopted different religions at some point, adopted different customs, but ethnically, and this is the part of any civilization, they are still the same people. And the fact that they try to discredit that and say, oh, the Canaanites are dead. They're no longer here. We finished them all off. These people were never gone. They're extinct people. And the way they portray that narrative, the average American or a person who empathizes with Israel would have you believe that people who live in Palestine, in that area, are only there from 100 years ago, and they came from Egypt and the Caucasus Mountains, and they came from other places, and they have no business being there. The Ottomans brought them there. That's what they literally believe, right? And so how do you even begin to have a conversation with someone if you can't even get to the source of the problem? And unfortunately, talking about the source of the problem requires you to have a platform, because these things are not something that you can just say in a 10, 15-minute conversation with someone on a political conversation, right? It requires a long-form format and requires you to have an audience that's going to listen. And that is one thing that social media allows you to have.
Now, you mentioned something earlier, which I agree with, but I'd like to, dive into that a little bit more. I am of the opinion, along with many others, is that this moment now in the entire history of 75 years of struggle, there have been many uprisings, there have been many, skirmishes and back and forth and all that. But this time is not the same. This time is much different than it has ever been. And one of the reasons why it is different than it has ever been is because of the information of the power and the stories that are coming out that are on individual, independent platforms that are able to come out, and the average American and the Western is able to see that, hey, all my life, we were told that these guys are bad guys and these are the terrorists and these are the extremists, but that's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is 6,000, more than 7,000 people have been killed now, and majority of them, what I see, are innocent moms, babies, children. That's what I'm seeing. Like this, I've been lied to my entire life. That's what people are saying. That's what the average American today is saying. And this is something that is unheard of and unprecedented. And I looked at the polls before I came here this evening. Today, as we speak now, majority of the Americans now today are in favor of having a ceasefire. Forget about the solution. We'll talk about the solution later. Are in favor of having ceasefire. And there's a huge shift in the amount of people that have changed their opinion in terms of blindly supporting a state that is carrying out these massacres and all these things. So do you think, how do you think this change happened and so quickly, or was it gradual?
Let me say one really quick thing. Murtada had just mentioned something about PR. But, we should really, really understand one thing is Israel may temporarily be winning this ground invasion and killing innocent people, right? They will be brought to justice in this world, inshallah, and if not, then they have Allah's justice waiting for them, right? But on a PR level, Israel is actually losing the war in PR for sure because of the amount of information that's coming out, and they know they're losing the PR war. So it's just this narcissist, spoiled brat that just is going to behave however they want, and they think everyone's going to follow suit. But as far as your question...
But how do we know they're losing the war? Do you have any examples of that? How are they losing the PR war?
Yeah, go ahead, Sim. You want to... How they're losing the PR war?
Well, fundamentally, what we're seeing now that we haven't seen in previous conflicts is a complete tidal shift of the narrative. But we're seeing a huge influx of Muslims of all ages that are on social media, and they're all tweeting, writing posts, sharing videos, and it's completely turned the tide against mainstream media. And so what we're seeing now is a narrative that is panicked, and most of the forget about Muslims, just non-Muslims, you're seeing conservatives in America who are allying with Palestine. There's the numbers are now 43% of conservatives see themselves as pro-Palestinian. That is a mind-blowing figure when you think about where we were even just 5-10 years ago. The narrative is shifting against them, and they know it. There's popular conservative figures online who have split from their faction, and there's arguments that are happening between each other, and they're accusing each other of taking money from Israel. So all kinds of things are being exposed right in front of our eyes, and this is one of the important things why it's so important. You don't have to be a podcaster. You don't have to be a YouTuber. You just have to be a Muslim on social media in a responsible way, where you don't let it take over your life. You share interesting items, share it with your Muslim brothers. Let your family know. If anything else, forget about your children. Forget about your wider friends and stuff. Just your children. It's so important for children to be educated about what's happening in Palestine. My dad taught me what's happening in Palestine right after the Accords in '91, and there are also Accords in '91, and I just saw them throwing rocks at a tank, and I fell in love with these people. I'm like, these are the coolest people ever, and I felt like I have to be behind this cause because this is something that is such a huge disproportionate opponent that you're facing up against. They need every avenue available to them to help. So yes, it's not the solution. I don't have the solution for you, at least the easy solution that you could do at home. What you can do is educate your children, make sure that they teach their children when they're grown up, and so that the continuity is established. It's not just ends with you or your kids, that it's a generational thing. We cannot allow this type of injustice to just dissipate, and that we just forget about it, and that we just leave it to the governments of the world to figure out. Because I promise you, when Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, when he was looking at establishing the state of Israel in Palestine, his own people laughed at him. His own people laughed at him. And what we do is when we have solutions in our Muslim community where we talk about Muslims having their own agency, that we take control of our own affairs, Muslims start laughing at each other like, oh, look at this guy, he wants to do something different. No, we have to take control. We have to take the reins in our hands. We have to realize, like, we can't get justice from people who don't want to give justice. We have to reach out and get the justice that we deserve. And that's a justice that Islam offers.
Carving our own path.
Carve our own path.
Have to carve their own path.
Carve our own path through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the true provider of justice, not the fake justice that the United Nations and the United States provides, where if they do provide justice, they seem to benefit from it. They seem to use, they seem to gain oil from toppling Saddam Hussein, and then they'll say to everyone, we got rid of a great evil man. We got rid of a horrible tyrant dictator in the Middle East. That was never on their agenda, but they will tout it and make it themselves seem righteous, that they did something amazing when that was not something that was their intent to begin with. But I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just wanted to add one thing to what he was on top of what he was mentioning, is that one thing really important as well. Of course, liking and sharing and spreading information is essential for bringing awareness.
Like, you're talking about this on any and all social media. I want to make sure, because not everyone here. I don't have a podcast platform, so what can I do?
Right. Let me recap what that means. So, for those of you that are on social media, number one, right, and we're talking about things like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I mean, these are some of the more common ones now, right? People, and if you're brave enough, you're going to be on TikTok, right? But that's very rare. But if you're on any of these formats, simply seeing content about things that are related to Muslims, whether they be landmark victories or even an injustice that happened even locally. For example, unfortunately, we had to all endure that poor child that was stabbed 26 times here in Plainfield, Illinois. Horrendous crime, horrific thing that happened. But making sure that news gets out beyond Chicago and beyond our community is done by sharing and spreading that information. And the reason why that's important is not only for the post on Facebook and Instagram, but what that does is, if you understand social media, how many of you guys were aware of Cambridge Analytica and what happened during the election and voting fraud and all that stuff, right? They were talking about PSYOPs, which is basically creating bubbles of information that make people just only see limited amounts of information within their bubble. So these are things based on algorithms. Okay, it's all it comes down to, algorithms. So every time you share something, you're helping the algorithm. You're pushing content that seems to, many people, 1,000 shared this in this area, let's push it out forward. 10,000 liked it, 15,000 liked it, great, let's push it out even further. So you're helping the algorithm push this content forward. And that's why people like us who are on YouTube, we don't ask for money all the time or anything like this. We say, hey, just like the video. Liking sometimes in some cases, which is essentially spreading the information, that helps us more than someone just making, hey, watch this tonight. Because that gets into an algorithm that then presents our content to the world, right? So by you liking a tweet, it's not just that you're agreeing with it, it's also you agreeing to get this in the world view, like to say, hey, I want to push this out. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about content that you're sharing, right? I know sometimes we're on social media and we just want to push funny stuff out there and say, aha, look at that laugh, right? But be conscious, because our likes and shares are like bullets for us today. That's literally like ammunition for us. Because we have, we're fighting a war of propaganda. So if you want to really be impactful, make sure that every like and share counts for something. Don't just put it out in the algorithm, because everything that you put out there that is unrelated or nonsensical, it shadows important news that comes out. So just remember that, right? And I just wanted to bring that point up.
And also, final thing on PR, just 30 seconds. If I'm not mistaken, there's a lot of events that occurred, a lot of claims even the president made, but because of pressure that they felt from social media, they actually had to retract statements, right?
Yes.
And they had to do that in front of the world. And if I'm not mistaken, the saying of Joe Biden of Hamas decapitating 40 babies, right? A lot of the pressure that came to actually for him to retract that statement was from social media and the hospital bombing. A lot of people actually did research independently and showed research of how that missile actually came from the Ahli hospital actually came from Israel and didn't come from Hamas, right? So Israel sees this, and I think that's another way that they can't get away with everything anymore. Before, people could have got away with anything they wanted because it was only news that was reporting. Now they can't get away with anything.
No. That's what we're talking about, right? That's a great point that you brought up, because I wanted to give specific examples. That imagine that the president of this country has made a statement saying that they found 40 babies that were murdered, that were killed or beheaded, or whatever he said. And then he was challenged on that, saying that this is not true, to the point that they were under so much pressure that they had to issue a retractment saying, no, he actually did not see any pictures. And then further investigation was done, and it found out that the source was actually one of the soldiers that are on the ground. He said that he saw that, but there's no evidence for it at all. So what I'm saying is that this is the power that social media brings, that there's so much power that it has that you can actually verify the information that you're being told that. And you can do that through multiple sources, right? Who else is reporting this? Where's the source? Where did this come from? And that's how you can narrow it down. The other thing is the propaganda war that is happening. It's in full force. There are pictures that are being shared of supposed massacres that the Palestinians have committed, but then it turns out that those pictures are AI generated, artificial intelligence.
Or sometimes they're Palestinians themselves. Huh? Sometimes it's actually the crime done by the Israelis to the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Like they'll show like charred bodies, and it actually end up being Palestinian bodies, not Israeli. But I think here's the important thing I want to share too. Sorry, in this as well, so I didn't mean to interrupt you, but speaking about the power of social media, the reason why the pushback came about the hospital event, the bombing that they did, the whole reason why there was pushback was because the IDF has someone named Haftan Naftali, who's basically the representative of, basically he self-proclaims this on his own video saying, Netanyahu brought me from the front lines to fight a different kind of war, which is the cyber war, to lead the cyber war. So basically he's the IDF's
social media
expert, whatever. His account and two other IDF accounts tweeted that they had successfully bombed the hospital, the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza, which is obviously the Christian hospital we're talking about there. But then mysteriously 6 hours or 4 hours later, the tweet gets deleted. But luckily, people had actually taken screenshots of it. And the old saying is true. Whenever you put something out on the internet, it is there forever. You can't undo it. And that's exactly what happened to them. When they push back on the narrative after they changed the video or they removed that and says, oh, I was mistaken, whatever, but people kept pushing this as an evidence, saying, wait a minute, the one who's in charge of IDF propaganda on Twitter, who Netanyahu appointed, is going to tweet out something of this big nature on an assumption? Nobody believes it. And they held them to a standard. And that forced the mainstream media like Reuters and CNN and BBC and LA Times, all of them to dig deeper and deeper, and eventually forced them to come out and say, listen, I remember specifically reading CNN said we scoured the internet looking for evidence of beheaded babies, about decapitations, massive rapes, these kind of things, and we were unable to find any of this. There's no credible news source that we can geolocate to a particular time and place this happened, but this only happened because social media pressure was mounting against them. And had it not been for social media, had it not been for some people that took screenshots of this behavior or the tweets that were out there, this would have been the narrative. They actually even opened a Wikipedia page for 40 decapitated babies.
Yeah.
Even though it's fake news, they act, and what I'm trying to get you to understand is that the reason why it's important now to push this out there is because there has been no bigger time in American history that people have such a level of distrust of information. That's one good thing that Donald Trump did for us. He made them all believe there's fake news, fake news, fake news, and they don't trust anything. So in that moment of chaos, be the source for authentic news. They're looking for sources outside of CNN and Fox News. So if they're looking for, half of our job is done. Allah is opening the door for us. All we have to do is share it. All we have to do is talk about it, and they're willing to listen. Because they don't trust their government, nor do they trust their news sources.
Now, one of the things we mentioned in the advertisement for the program is that we wanted to have a good opportunity for questions from those who are attending here. So if you have any questions or comments that you would like to ask, now would be the time. Or we can continue. We don't want to be the only ones talking up here.
And if you already asked a question, you can ask more. You can ask double.
The brother, give the microphone to the brother here. He's got a question. He has a question, and then you can take it after.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Thank you very much for coming today. We learned a lot from your research and your guidance on this conflict. And I wanted to make a couple of points, one on Brother Amr, about the mainstream media. And I'm glad that you don't have any sponsors because you can tell the truth as it is. You're not bound by a sponsor who tells you their narrative. That's exactly the problem with mainstream media today. The CNNs, the Fox News, and NBCs, they're not reliable anymore because they put their own framing on the news, their own opinion, and because of the availability to get the news from the source, from the ground, a lot of people are turning off the mainstream media versus to go to the social media platforms that Brother Omer mentioned. So that's good. I'm glad that you don't have any sponsors that you have to abide by. I want to make one it's a comment, but also a question to Brother Omer. So with the advent of social media, there is a deluge of postings on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp. And so there's obviously pros and cons to that. The pros, as I said, is the ability to get the news from the ground without any tainted or without any reframing. But there's also the problem of fake news. I get a lot of postings, and sometimes I don't want to be guilty of forwarding fake news and contributing to something that has been vetted. And sometimes I have to go and do a vetting and do a Googling before I forward it. And you can't always do it. Sometimes you fail. So my personal challenge is how can I be a good Muslim in basically filtering the bad and forwarding the good stuff?
Sure. I think that's a good question. I can answer it, and then you guys can take it from there too. I think it's a legitimate question. It's something that plagues our community, and that is the blind forwarding of news or events that you get. And if, oftentimes it's not accurate, it's not correct. Sometimes it could be dangerous as well. If half of that stuff was true, alhamdulillah, Muslims had found the cure for COVID even before COVID came, because somehow they knew the cure for it. So
onion juice.
Yes, onion juice, and their grandma's recipe, or alhamdulillah, they had the cure. So it is a bit of a challenge. But what I personally do is, if it's a news that is, it depends on the type of news and how much impact it is going to have in the community or in the society or in general. If it's something that I feel that is pressing, someone sent it to me, you can easily verify that by going to reputable sources and see if they're actually reporting that as well. You can check a couple of sources and see if they're reporting it. Maybe it's the details may not all be there, but in general, the story is there. Let's say like someone sent me news saying that there's been a mass shooting. Let's just say that, for example, because unfortunately we're living in America and that's the norm, just as we found out a couple of days ago. Now, instead of me blindly following that, I'm going to go to reputable sources. I'll take that back. I wouldn't say reputable. I would say major sources. Now, whether they're reputable or not, that's, I could go to CNN, I could go to NBC, and see if they are reporting that too. And if they are, that means that this is credible. Then I can send it to someone else, because I don't want to be responsible. You should not be responsible for creating panic in the community or sending information that that you yourself cannot verify. If you cannot verify, don't be part of spreading that news.
It's a little bit more complicated than that. I know, like, for example, like the mass shooting that we heard the other night. That's pretty verifiable. You can understand from major news outlets that this is. When it comes to situations like Palestine, there's going to be a bias. There's a directive that is coming not just from the media, but from the government itself. The government is sending diplomats, their U.S. diplomats, all over the world with instructions that do not even talk about a ceasefire. So they are telling not just their diplomats, but the media, and because media works with the government, because in order for media to write stories, they need to gain access. And they would want to make the government happy by listening to them and say, hey, when we tell you to do something, you do it. And this is how we want the story to be framed as. We want the Palestinians to look like the bad guys, like they're the ones who blew up their own hospitals, that they were doing mass beheadings of babies, etc. So you have to use a little bit of common sense and say, okay, well, if it's about Palestine, I'm not going to take their word for it. I'm going to try to find out news from, there's a great Instagram channel called Eye on Palestine. You can check them and see what they have to say. There's many different outlets. Al Jazeera is a very reputable outlet. They're even also being pressured by the United States government to change their coverage on Palestine as well. But the point is, don't rely just on American sources. I would probably check BBC or Al Jazeera and other sources and see if there's any credibility to that. But oftentimes you'll see that even after all your fact checking and stuff, there will be situations, especially with the Gaza thing, with the hospital bombing, they can really mess with your head, and you won't know what's true and what's false, because they can even create fake videos, and that's what they were trying to do with the missile attack and making it appear to be Palestinian origin. So it's a bit tricky, and it takes some experience to navigate. This is why you just don't jump into a conflict like Gaza. You should be experienced, and you should always keep your finger on the news so that you know how to navigate this and swim with this kind of the current news cycle.
And sometimes even I think a little bit of common sense also would help as well. For example, you talk about this bombing, the hospital bombing. Unfortunately, what we've been told is, it was a misfire. So if we were to go with that story, let's say we go with that story. So, in the entire conflict, it seems like they only had one missile of that caliber, which misfired. They haven't used it before that, nor since then.
And it hit the hospital.
Yes.
It happened to hit a hospital of all places. Couldn't have hit a small residential building or a farm area that was nearby. 'Cause there's a lot of unincorporated areas as well. So
Because
it's
they only
funny.
had one.
Yes.
They only had one.
And they never hit a hospital before, by the way. So they're so pure and innocent that the Israelis.
No, by the way, they had, and people don't realize it, but they had the Al Quds hospital just down the street. They hit that one too. I mean, but no one talked about it, right? Because this is the one that seems so. Because why this hospital was the Christian Baptist hospital. They knew that it's a very different narrative. If they said the Quds hospital, okay, yeah, maybe Hamas is hiding there. That's what they'll say, right? But if it's the Christian hospital, they know that looks very negative because a larger a portion of the donors are Christians from America. But coming back to the issue of and being responsible on social media, like how to find out. I've oftentimes found that if you sometimes just take a second to let the information come out. Sometimes very quick to share something, and
So
oftentimes if
it's
you
not
wait-
always the race to be the first one to break
yeah,
the
like
news.
you don't have to be the first to just like breaking news, right? You're not the radio. You don't have to do that. Let it come out. Usually, oftentimes, waiting a few hours or maybe a day, you generally have more accurate information. You'll know more. Is there a disputed story here, or is it the narrative agreed upon by everybody? And then I think also oftentimes enough to really, it's important to note as well that it's okay to say that you were wrong about something. Okay, say, hey, I've done it many times and said, hey, sorry, that post was actually inaccurate, and I pull it down and I say, hey, I want to make sure that, this was actually not, I'm putting out false information. And unfortunately, with social media, that comes with the territory. You're going to have people I've seen people who have good intentions. For example, they were trying to show that, the atrocities that are happening in Palestine, but they were actually commenting on a video that happened in Syria. And so they meant good, right? But the problem is we as Muslims have to be extremely accurate because not only do we have eyes on us, but more importantly, Allah is watching us, right? We have to be accurate in our information, in our speech, right? And that's one thing that, keep in mind, the one reason why people are looking for other media is because they're dissatisfied with the dishonesty in mainstream media. So we have to try our hardest to be absolutely accurate. And if we do make a mistake, don't be afraid to retract it and issue apologies for that.
Let me just say one thing, if you don't mind. Another 30 seconds, inshallah. He mentioned you have to have at least some common sense. I'm kind of one of those people who doesn't have that much common sense, especially when it comes to politics. So I have a group of people which I trust their politics very much, and I'll post like 10 times a day on there, and they'll tell me, this doesn't look right, this doesn't, and I won't share it until I share it with them first. So I think, but in all seriousness, every single one of us, especially at a time like now, Allah is giving us a sign where you have to get together with people that are very honest and that have a good understanding of Islam with them, and they also understand politics very well. They're not biased. They don't just say, hey, we're Muslims, we only support Democrats. We're Muslims, we only support Republicans. Somebody who doesn't even bind themselves by any political party per se, because there's going to be no biases. They look at the world for what it is through an Islamic lens. Have a group of people like that where you can share stuff and be like, hey, what do you guys think about this? Because there's some people who've been studying politics for 20, 30 years, just follow it very, very closely. And I think every Muslim, like myself, who doesn't have political common sense, I need those people around me. So I just kind of, on a practical level, to share that with a group of people who will remain unnamed.
All right, so I have one question, maybe not on the content, but what is the resources and effort behind running a podcast? How much time do you spend in researching and how much time do you spend on the technical matters?
Surprisingly, we get this question a lot. Many of us, all three of us, all of our lives, we've spent quite a bit of time reading all kinds of different sorts of literature. Now, obviously, none of us is, each of us has a strength in a particular subject over another, and we're able to talk about something more intelligently while the other two of us is kind of asking more questions about it or supplementing the discussion with another way. But usually, because we have full-time jobs, we're kind of doing our research between like our lunch breaks and stuff like that. So and we have a WhatsApp group where we kind of share some ideas about what we want to talk about, and it's essentially up to each one of us to kind of prepare for it.
Yeah, fortunately, as we've grown as a podcast, we have a core group of listeners that actually engage us. I think I'm actually happy that and not to be like too arrogant or anything, but I think we're unique in a way that our listeners are actually people who actively listen, and they engage us, and they actually provide us a lot of material. They say, hey, what if you guys talk about this? Or they'll highlight information that's important to them. And we have a similar mindset, right? And that was part of our goal in the beginning, to have, a culture or a group of people that were similar in thinking and to unify that, right? So alhamdulillah, it worked for us where we have a core group of individuals that generally have the same understanding and the same interest. And so they also help us pick, not only the subject matter, but also recommend guests that they would like to see on the show. And so it's very important, if you're ever going to do something like this, to tap into your listener base, because ultimately they're your bread and butter, right? They're the people who are going to provide you the best feedback because they want you to succeed. They want to listen to your content, right? So I think fortunately we've been blessed, alhamdulillah, with a very good, strong listener base that also provides great information and content for us to talk about.
Numbers aren't always important. Like a listener base is important. It's always been important for every change that any level of humanity and any time and place that any change had to take place. And it's not always about the numbers. Like people, if you just feel like just starting a YouTube channel and just giving your thoughts on the whole Palestinian issue, for instance, right? Like, and if you get like 10 views, that your goal shouldn't be that, why didn't I get 1,000 views already? Why didn't I get 20,000 views? Because that doesn't matter. And the large group doesn't matter unless you're in it completely for the money, or you have some other thing like, I want to monetize off of YouTube. That's a different thing, right? But if you just want to speak your heart and get some truth out there, and when I say truth, I mean on the level through the Islamic lens of what Islam befits to be halal and what Islam befits to be haram, then speak whatever it is, and speak openly, and don't worry about the numbers, right?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. As Muslim, this is also a very fundamental point, right? Like, Allah doesn't expect you to make sure that every single person hears your message. All He expects is that you say something about the injustice. You do your part, and Allah will do the rest. I've seen people who have made a tweet, nobody, and they've gone viral for something they said, and Allah allowed it to happen. These are things that will happen, but this is all about doing your part, right? If you want to jump in for the money, then that's your intention. Right? You're going to do everything for the money. Some people want to monetize. They want to build
Is there
a brand.
anything wrong with that?
Look, I'm not here to tell you it's wrong, but I'm saying that's a different intention, right? And so you have to know, only you yourself know your intention. Can you balance both? Can you say, hey, I want to do this full time, and that's why I need the monetization? And Allah knows, right? But it comes down to sincerity. And at the end of the day, we only do this because we're trying to do something that Allah has commanded us to do, which is speak the truth, and to get information out, to make da'wah, to bring Islam to the forefront, right? And so all we have to do is our part. There are people even just look at our previous generation. They came to this country. They started off in humble beginnings with maybe just a basement somewhere, and that becomes a school, and then a masjid, and so forth, and bigger and bigger. They would never thought that you had a masjid that had full-time schools and place for janazah and ghusl and all these things. But this is the work that Allah does when you do a little effort. So your one voice can be something. And this is like the same thing with Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. When he was going away from Fir'aun, what happened? His people were complaining. Where are you going? Where are you taking us? You brought us to the sea. We're going to die here. What are you going to do? He didn't question that. Allah told him, just do these things. Just do it. Put the effort in. And then Allah obviously splits the sea for him. The same thing with Maryam alayhi salam. Allah told her to shake the trunk of the tree. What's a woman going to do? To shake the trunk of a palm tree. It's a big palm tree. But it's the effort you put in. And then Allah does the rest of it. So if you're going to do it with the intention that you're doing it fi sabilillah, and that you ask Allah to make you a source of goodness, and then He will do the rest of it.
We had another question here.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jazakallah khair for sharing your insights. I have two sets of questions, by the way. So one set of question is relevant to what you're discussing right now, and the other one is a little tangent, but you can answer that as well. So the first question I have is, I do my best to, at my individual level, to educate people about the ongoing conflict out there. But there are some avenues where actually you cannot be posting all these kind of things. For example, LinkedIn is a platform for educational stuff, for professional stuff. But I do see an Israeli lobby out there also. So it's, as a Muslim, it's I feel guilty also, but I feel like it's my responsibility to hold myself back in those kind of situations and not make it uncomfortable for my colleagues and my other individuals which are out there on LinkedIn, which is a professional platform that can have a repercussions to my work environment as well. So I want to make sure that we have to know the audience also before we post something out there. I want to know what your thoughts about that. And then second question I have is, the podcasts that you do you also cover controversial subjects like, beating the wife and those kind of things which are, can be kind of controversial as well. So in the Muslim world, do you cover that as well? Beating the wife,
Beating the wife?
Beating the wife, it's like a most popular question coming from the non-Muslims. Yeah, divorces.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about, this is
let him finish. Let him
Oh,
finish
I'm
the
sorry.
question.
Yeah, so these are the two questions, that I had. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so I think when you're coming on social media, you have to realize what your objective is. There are people who engage in polemical, channels or avenues, and there's a lot of material that there is to refute. I mean, this can be in the area of polemics in terms of in dawah, in terms of just the narrative about Muslims. There's just data about Muslims. I mean, there's a lot of different areas. I have experience in that area as well too, and that's where a lot of these people who end up being on mainstream news sources, they usually start in polemical dawah, meaning there will be arguments that maybe the Christians will make, and they'll spread something about Muslims that for example, to common things like the age of Aisha radiallahu anha, or the idea of Muslim men and treatment of their wives, or the idea of polygyny, or the idea of terrorism, or the idea of the Quran through Tawbah. All these things, there's a number. I bet you many of you guys will know them off the top because they're repeated over and over again. And these are, there's plenty of opportunity to refute these things. And I encourage people, if you have the ability to do that, the more content that comes out about that, it is better, it's good. But I think that right now there's a lot of information out there already regarding that. So we don't tend to focus our podcast on that because, again, that's really like kind of, we have to get into sources and source material, the hadith, the ayat of the Quran, the explanation, tafasir, right? So we're not really like this polemical channel, right? But if one wants to do that, it's fine. I think what we try to do is highlight the issues that are related to the average person here. Like what you're going to think about, what you can experience. Our main target audience is Muslims and those that are familiar with Muslim issues already. I'm not trying to convince anyone to become a Muslim by my podcast. That's a separate thing that we do on the side, right? Not to say if they come, no problem. Alhamdulillah, Allah, make them more curious. But we're not a dawah podcast. Right?
So would you say your podcast is what, weekly? How many episodes do you have? It's weekly, right?
We do a roundtable weekly, and if we have a guest, we do it on the weekend.
All right. So the issue that you discuss every week is dependent on what is happening in the Muslim community. What's the hottest subject that we, what happened? Who's accused of what? For example, who's accused of what? Or what's, you got you got a conference coming up. Maybe you went somewhere. Or,
yeah, so it'll be like a midweek episode on Wednesday night where we talk about general items, anything that's happening that's newsworthy. And typically on the weekend where we will have a guest who comes in either over Zoom or what we're trying to do is someone who's local nowadays because we're trying to get people in the studio to have better discussions. Usually discussions happen better when they're in person. So we do our best to get people in studio to come in and talk to us. So those are the weekend episodes is usually when you see some of the more notable names that come on the program. Wednesday night is just, we're just being loose with our listeners and talking about whatever's happening with Muslims at that moment.
Just one quick thing, yeah. As far as, like you mentioned, controversial issues or people misunderstanding issues about Islam, so there's certain followings that podcasts have, and certain podcasts focus on certain things, right? Within our podcast, once in a while, if the conversation leads to, for instance, like you mentioned, the controversial issue that people falsely state about Muslim men just beating their wives senseless, and it's a part of our religion, that kind of stuff will come up once in a while based on where the conversation goes. We don't specifically focus on those things. And this is the way I see it. And I think that's a beautiful thing. We all kind of see the podcast differently, even though we're on the same podcast, because we're all very different in our personalities, actually. But we're like best friends, you know, and we grew up together. But we're all kind of very different. And I think that's a great thing. It kind of shows that Muslims can do things together, even though they're completely different from each other. But when we discuss issues that have to do with controversial topics, we'll touch upon it once in a while. We'll talk about it if it's related to something of that week of what we're discussing. And I'll tell you why that's very, very important. It's not like we're a tabloid where, okay, we're looking for the hot thing and we're going to talk about it locally and hopefully we get likes. That's not what it is. It's like this thing is very, very popular. Muslims are talking about this. How should Muslims look at this issue? Because things and events that occur can be very deceiving, right? Especially if there's a narrative that's given to you, it's taught to us how we're supposed to look at it. And we also talk about, and this is where Sim and Mort come in more so than I do, is understanding an issue, especially on a political level, and how we're supposed to think about this very carefully. And I think that's where Sim actually comes in, who's obviously the host and the founder of the podcast, is how are we supposed to think about this? What is sound thinking based on this issue right here? What should our concept be of this? Because we can be given lots of news, and we can just take it for what it is, but how is a Muslim supposed to digest this issue, look at it properly? And that's what made Ibrahim alayhi salam different than everybody else. He saw things for what they are. Usually, when you and I go through a trial and tribulation, that's when we kind of see things for what they are because we're only dependent on Allah then. But if we're living very well, alhamdulillah, and generally, as far as human beings are concerned, when we don't have too many worries and we're kind of in this la-la land, we don't have to see things for what they are. But when we're cornered and we go through trials and tribulations, then the dust settles and we see things very, very differently because of that trial and tribulation that we're going through. Our goal is to give those events and those things that are happening, how are we supposed to look at those through the Islamic lens? As if, you know, we're trying to follow the Sunnah of Ibrahim alayhi salam, seeing things for what they are, right?
Any other questions or comments? Before you ask the question, I want to come back to. We forgot about the first question that he asked, which was the platforms and knowing your audience. For example, he mentioned LinkedIn. Am I gonna go on my LinkedIn page and start posting pictures and videos about what's happening in Gaza,
yes.
or how should I behave myself?
Right. So sorry, that was a great question too. Yes, I mean this is also, think of it as social media as also a lot of ways in real life, right? Like if you're in the workplace, right, you're not just gonna start broadcasting news, right? Like you're kind of busy working, right? Like if there's a time and place.
I can't post about the massacre that's happening in my group channel at work. Yeah. Are you saying I can't do that?
Yeah. My point being is that it's about relevance, right? So, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. I don't really post much of anything on LinkedIn, right? It's not relevant to that place. Places like TikTok, or Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, people are more open to looking for content other than a wide variety of content, right? So understanding where you are, like for example, basic etiquette, like for example, if you're on Twitter, right, you're not going to try to make a series of posts that, a 10-page article and put it in a bunch of tweets and expect people to read that and follow the thread. It's not going to work. Twitter is designed to be like 140 lines or characters, and then it's a short burst of message that people get, right? So whereas things like maybe a blog site that you would have or something like Reddit, right, which is a far bigger, you can write paragraphs and paragraphs, right? So being aware of which platform you're on helps you understand what type of information you should be sharing in terms of its relevance, size, content type, whether it's audio or video.
And it
written.
optimizes your
Right.
what is to be used for as
'Cause
well, right?
ultimately that's
TikTok
it.
mainly is for videos. I'm not gonna post my essay on there.
Right, ultimately that's it, right? Like you don't want to go on YouTube and just scroll down a piece of paper with your message, right? The whole idea is to have video content, right? So being aware of it and understanding time and place is very important in social media in terms of being effective.
Okay, we have one more question. If you have something to add, you can add 30 seconds. We'll take one more question, and now I want to end. I have one question that I want to end with. So you have something to add?
Just make sure that when you're on LinkedIn, the whole world sees that, at least when it affects your money, and you're doing no good by getting fired from your workplace by putting something that, draws the ire of your company, because you're essentially representing the company you work for when you're on LinkedIn. So just be very careful with LinkedIn, but ultimately stick to, I try not to put anything related to my work on social media, but I'm in the public, right? So I have to be extra careful beyond everyone. So in general, be really careful with what you
Okay,
comment.
we have a question that came online. Because it's related to this, we'll take 30 seconds to answer this quickly, because some of it we already talked about. Then we'll go to that, and then we'll end with this. The question is, as Muslims here living in peace, how can we create platform and speak without fear of losing school or job or worse? So build
Yeah.
on what you just talked about here.
Yeah, ultimately, everything has a price, right? Even free speech in this country, it says, yes, it's free speech, but if you say something that may make sense to you in that moment, we're not talking about something that's dangerous that you say recklessly. We're not talking about yelling fire in a theater. We're talking about something like, for example, you say something pro-Hamas related, and the right conditions on the 7th of October, you say something like that when the facts, or at least when the public sentiment is drawing the ire of that group, whether they don't care about the facts or anything, they don't know what you've seen. You have to have this kind of an antenna on the top of your head, knowing how to deal with, or at least understanding the climate in which you can speak about something intelligently. Ultimately, if you are reckless, you're going to get in trouble, and there are limitations to free speech. There have been many people who've said stuff in that heat of the moment after the first couple of days. Very respectable, intelligent people. We're not talking about people who didn't know what they were saying. Just people who got riled up in the moment, and they said these are high physicians, people who are really respected members of the community. They got angry and they let their emotions out of control, and they eventually lost their job because of the reckless support that they gave towards something that their company did not want to be associated with. And so that's unfortunate. You have to be careful. You have to know how to navigate some of these.
So would you say
languages and
keeping
things.
your emotions in check, use common sense, and if like the rule, don't post anything, don't share anything when you're angry, or if you write it down,
Absolutely.
don't hit send, wait, give it some time, review it, and then if it looks good still, then do it.
Have someone else, maybe your wife,
Have
look at
someone
it.
else review it.
Say-
Well, I don't know about that, but
No, so just at least have someone that you trust, who has a good,
All right.
a good handle on things. Look at it.
we need to wrap it up in the next 4 minutes. I want to give the brother here a chance, and then
So
we'll
I
wrap
got
it up after that.
Just two questions. One of them is, do you have any plans in the future to build out like kind of a media company, something similar to like something like the Daily Wire? Because I know those things. I mean, you guys have pretty much been, I think, butting heads with their messaging for.
They're looking for your
That's a lot.
donations.
Subhanallah. I mean, that leads into the second step is, how do you look for collaborators in your vision and your mission? And is that something that you guys have planned out, or is it just kind of organic?
There were a lot of these kind of ideas that were floating around when we were first starting the show. Ultimately, the climate or the landscape of social media or Muslim influencers right now is so wide that I don't think there is a type of a Daily Wire type of format that we can set up unless you have someone who just is the kingpin of influencers who are able to pull everyone together. You need someone really big like a Muhammad Hijab or someone who has that kind of a pull to form that kind of a coalition between podcasters and YouTubers. So what he's talking about is basically some of the conservatives set up a company called the Daily Wire, who has a group of many different other conservative influential listeners, and they set up their own network and their own paywall so that only people who subscribe to their content can get it. And ultimately, I think that is a disservice to their own cause. I think it only prevents access of their information or their content to the wider environment or the wider public. We as Muslims shouldn't be thinking in this kind of a capitalist method or way. We should actively try to promote our content to as many people as we can and try to restrict as many paywalls or any other type of roadblock for them to access knowledge.
Okay, Isha is at 8 o'clock. I want to bring this to a conclusion. I had a question that I wanted you guys to answer that, but I'm going to ask the question. I don't want you to answer that because I want you to meet with the brothers here that are here. While some may need time to go to wudu, where you can interact and mingle and talk about this. The question or the thing that I wanted you guys to comment on is we talked about all the positives and the benefits of social media and the advantages and all of that thing, but there must be some downsides to that as well. So if you can talk to us briefly about that. Should I be watching videos 24/7, or should I be sharing and posting, everything and anything that I see, or how does that work? I don't want you to answer that now because we don't have the time for that, but I'll come and meet you, and the brothers will come meet you and talk to you. I'm sure you're going to stick around. Isha is at 8 o'clock, inshallah. So we can talk about that, inshallah. So I would ask Sheikh Amr to conclude with a short dua, inshallah, and then we'll call for the adhan for Isha, inshallah.
اللهم انت السلام ومنك السلام تبارك يا ذا الجلال والاكرام. اللهم اعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. اللهم اعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. اللهم اعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى ال محمد كما صليت على ابراهيم وعلى ال ابراهيم انك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى ال محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا. واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا. أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you for coming. That concludes the program for this evening. The brothers are here if you want to meet them and talk to them individually, inshallah. We'll call for the Isha Adhan now.